Good evening. Welcome everybody to this seminar, to this webinar that Texas Family Enrichment has organized. This is the 6th lecture. We welcome Fr Sean Kilcawley from the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska, that is joining us today to present the topic, a very important topic, which is he titled the lecture, Parenting Pioneers, Navigating the Hyper-Sexualized Culture. And he has a lot of experience with this topic. I had the pleasure to meet him a few years ago here in Houston. So I thought this was an important topic for us parents to, to learn and to really, be aware of the dangers that this hypersexual culture is presenting to our children. So a little bit about Father Sean. He was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Lincoln in 2005. But before entering the seminary, he graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1996 and served for 3 years active duty as an infantry officer in the United States Army. He studied at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family at the Lateran University in Rome, earning a license of sacred theology, and has completed training in sex addiction treatment from the SATP Institute and the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. He currently serves as the Diocese of the Diocese of Lincoln as the Director of the Office for Family Life. He has focused his efforts on diocesan activities to prevent early exposure to pornography and resources of intervention and healing for those affected by pornography, to include educating parents, running support groups for addicts and their spouses, educating clergy, and speaking at conferences on the best practices and resources for addressing pornography at the parish and diocesan level. In 2019, he completed certification as a pastoral sexual addiction practitioner through the International Institute for Trauma and Addictions Professional. So after his lecture, Father Sean will answer a few questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A button and submit them through there. That's preferably, do not use the chat button. So without further ado, Father Sean, you're welcome to start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. It's a joy to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. I also want to thank everybody who's joining for this presentation today, and because it really means that you love your children and that you want to give them your best, and there's just such a great need that every child has to experience the love of their parents and to really learn to love well in a world that doesn't always know how to love well. A little bit more about myself, kind of my own family that I grew up in. I come from a blended family. My father was married when he was about 19 in Ireland. He had 2 daughters and a son in his first marriage, and then got divorced. Moved to the United States when he was about 22, and where he met my mother. My mother was also previously married with 2 children and was divorced when she met my dad. They got married, I was born, and then my mother died of cervical cancer when I was about 2 years old. And then my father remarried again and had 3 more children, and another 2 sisters and a brother from that union. And then when I was in college, they also got divorced. And so kind of my joke I always say is that's how I became the family life office director for my diocese. But it is the family that God gave me, and it's the family that I learned to love in, or that I didn't learn to love so well in. And, in my own story, from a young age, I felt called to be a priest. And a lot of that had to do with really like having a desire to get to heaven so I could meet my mother. After high school, I did go to military academy at West Point, graduated in 1996. Served at Fort Campbell, Kentucky for the first 3 years of active duty. And then at that point, I just felt our Lord calling me, and I felt like I couldn't run away from him anymore. And so I started asking questions about getting out of the military, and met the right people who sent me in the right directions. And so I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska in 1999, where I entered seminary and was ordained a priest in 2005. I went to Rome to study in 2009, and I got an advanced degree in marriage and family theology, which was really a multifaceted degree. And so I had courses in philosophy, theology, psychology, sociology, all looking at marriage, family, and human sexuality. And when I returned to the diocese, I was in charge of our religious education. And so my efforts were around forming a curriculum for chastity for our Catholic schools. And as I was reworking that curriculum, and I was really proud of it, and I thought, oh, all my knowledge is going to change the world. After a very short period of time, I realized that curriculum wasn't going to be sufficient, right? It was good, but not sufficient. And I think good, but not sufficient is a good way to frame things tonight. Because from the time I left to go to Rome until I came back to Rome, the whole world shifted. When I left in 2009, the biggest distraction in my high school classroom was kids that were texting during class, and they could put their hand in their pocket and feel the buttons on their phone and send a message without looking at it. When I came back from Rome, they can't do that anymore because all their phones have screens. But all those screens also give them access to absolutely everything on the internet. And there's so many gifts that we can find on the internet, but there's also a lot of dangers. And that average age of exposure to pornography has dropped down to between 8 and 11 years old now. And so we have to stop and ask ourselves, how do we teach the truth, beauty, and goodness of God's plan for marriage and human sexuality? Or how do we just teach our kids to have proper relationships? Or how do we give our kids a chance to grow and mature in a way that's healthy when they're consuming this anti-message all of the time? And so that's when I shifted my focus, and I started to work with parents on protecting their kids from pornography. And I've had the great joy of working with many, many, many college students. We just finished a healing retreat in Kansas City. We had several men on the retreat, and we had quite a few young men on the retreat. And listening to their stories, all of their addictions, all of their sexual kind of problems or compulsive sexual behavior started like way back when they were 10, 11, or 12 years old. And so that statistic is accurate. And so I just want to use that to inform what we're talking about tonight. And kind of when I look at the adults I work with who have problems in this area, like what could have been different for them within their families, in their relationship with their parents, with the education that they had or the protections that were in place to mitigate the effects of the hypersexualized culture that we live in, right? It's really hard to prevent everything, but we can definitely mitigate, and we can respond in a way that gives our kids the best chance, right? The best chance of living lives that are fully human, right? That are living lives that are fully human. And so I'm going to pull up my slideshow, and I'm going to stand up because it's easier for me to present that way. So just a couple of statistics, right? And just lots of you are probably aware of how bad things are, but just to make sure we're on the same page, right? The United States accounts for about $13 billion of the $97 billion made worldwide each year by the pornography industry. There are more than 11,000 pornographic films shot in the US each year, which is a little more than 30 per day. High pornography users are found to score higher on things like acceptance of the rape myth, acceptance of violence against women, adversarial sex beliefs, reported likelihood of committing rape or forced sex acts, and sexual callousness, which basically just means that like as their conscience is eroded, high pornography users are more likely not to recognize sexual boundaries. They're more likely to cross sexual boundaries, and they're just more likely to be unaware, right, of what it means to respect another person. 22% of adolescent females and 36% of young women have sent nude photos or videos of themselves. And sexting on an average starts about when kids are 14, where they're sending or receiving nude photos, which has all kinds of legal consequences because it's actually the production and distribution of child pornography. And it also has this consequence that it's forever online. And it's another conversation that parents didn't have to have years and years and years and years ago, or even 5 years ago. But it's part of a conversation that probably needs to be taking place today. According to the National Survey of Family Growth conducted in the United States, 21% of men and 8% of women have 15 or more sexual partners in their lifetime. Research from the CDC says 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused before the age of 18. Right? And a lot of research is starting to show that peer-to-peer sexual abuse, and this is also my experience of working with adults, peer-to-peer sexual abuse has become more and more common, right? Which is something that goes beyond a kind of normal exploration of I'll show you mine, you show me yours, but it's more like simulated sex acts or performing sex acts on each other from a young age, when really that first experience for the person is I have no understanding of what's going on. And the average age of first exposure, as I said, is between 8 and 11. And so what researchers are finding is that first exposure is leading to a kind of repetition of what they're seeing online, which leads to abuse. When it comes to marriages, the American Association of Matrimonial Lawyers says 1 in 4 marriages end due to online pornography use. And 33% of men and 25% of women report at least one extramarital sexual act or affair. And again, the American Association of Matrimonial Lawyers says 30% of American marriages end due to infidelity, right? And so all those statistics, they sound really bad, and they are really bad. But take a breath. And I just want to lay that out because that's what we're talking, that's the consequence of not protecting our kids or not having these consequences or these conversations. And when we think about okay, how do we talk to our kids about this? The way I want to frame that is it's a balancing act of mercy and justice, or mercy and moral judgment. Sometimes I think parents have a tendency, and I as a priest can have a tendency to be overly merciful and to think, well, this isn't really that big a deal, and everybody kind of has this problem, and it's not really an addiction. It's leaning into that kind of mercy. The opposite is the moral judgment, and when it's in its extreme form, it turns into a lot of shaming behaviors. It turns into a lot of punishment without a lot of explanation. A lot of the young men that I work with, and the first time that they got caught viewing pornography, their phone was taken away. They might have been locked out of the bedroom. They had severe consequences. And what they learned from that experience was just they needed to hide their behavior better. Right? And so we want to thread that needle. Pope Francis, when he wrote a document called Amoris Laetitia, he talks about this same concept of balancing mercy and moral judgment. And he says, although she constantly holds up the call to perfection and asks for a fuller response to God, the church must accompany with attention and care the weakest of her children who show signs of a wounded and troubled love by restoring in them hope and confidence, like the beacon of a lighthouse in a port, or a torch carried among the people to enlighten those who have lost their way, or who are in the midst of a storm. Right? And so there's this idea that we always hold up this call to perfection and ask for a fuller response to God. As a parent, we always hold up this call to be good, right? And this is the standard that we want our kids to live by. And we hold that up. But we also must accompany with attention and care the weakest of our children who show signs of a wounded and troubled love. And among those people who show signs of a wounded and troubled love are children of divorce, children who grew up in families like mine, bouncing from mom's house, dad's house, different rules, different house. Children who have suffered some kind of abuse or neglect. children who were inadvertently exposed to pornography on the iPhone that they received as a birthday gift. I don't know who has more signs of a wounded and troubled love than that kid. Right? And so how do we enter into that person's life? How do we walk them towards virtue? Right? In the church, we talk about, I'm going to enter into this wounded person's life and walk them towards Jesus. Right? And so how do we enter into their life and walk them towards virtue? When we talk about this problem of pornography, a lot of times people will ask this question like, well, is it an addiction? And I think the biggest reason to try to cut it off early, right, and to try to speak into it, like when our kids are young and have constant conversations while they're growing up, is because it does become an addiction. An addiction is a compulsive need for and use of a habit-forming substance like nicotine or alcohol, characterized by tolerance and well-defined physiological symptoms upon withdrawal. Right, broadly, persistent compulsive use of a substance known by the user to be harmful, right? I'm doing something that's bad for me. We can also call it a compulsive relationship with a mood-altering behavior. And so a lot of times when people are addicted to pornography or they're addicted to compulsive sexual behaviors, it's because it alters their mood, right? They do it because they either don't want to feel anything, right? Or they don't want to feel their negative feelings like sadness or grief or loss or anger. And instead of knowing how to read and respond to our emotions, we just kind of numb out on this thing. Right? We also see the same thing with numbing out with social media, video games, television, Netflix, binging, whatever it might be. So we can call it when we rely on a substance instead of a person to regulate our emotions. Like we're designed in such an amazing way that our brains are really designed to regulate themselves in relationship, and we see that with children from the youngest age. Like when I go visit my nieces, one of my nieces, when she was 11 months old, I was really excited to see her, and I picked her up and I was holding her, and she did not know who I was, and her brain just started going like, this is an unsafe person, and she started like kicking and arching her back and reaching and crying. And then I like handed her to her mom. And as soon as she came in contact with mom's body, it was like, shoot, everything's okay, because mom has the magic. And we develop an attachment relationship with our primary caregivers, primarily with mom. That attachment starts in utero. And so they become our safe people that bring us into regulation when our brain's telling us something's wrong. My other niece, when she was about 3, I went up to her and I was like, hey, Bridget, I'm your Uncle Sean. And you could see her brain lighting up like stranger danger. And she starts looking around the room. She found her mom, went to her mom, wrapped her arm around mom's leg, brought her brain back into regulation. And she was able to kind of look out at me and engage me. Right? Because we need people in order to regulate our emotions. Sometimes when addiction comes in, what happens is instead of finding a person, I reach for a thing. Like sometimes people might reach for alcohol. Sometimes people might reach for drugs. We might reach for technology or a tablet or social media or pornography. And that becomes the thing we go to when our emotions are dysregulated. And so a lot of the recovery principles point to like learning to regulate in a healthy way again, right? To rely on people instead of substances or things or other behaviors. So we could say to take refuge in a substance, right? Like if I'm bored, lonely, angry, stressed, tired, and this is what I do, then it's become my refuge. Right? It's become my safe place, and from a religious perspective, like I also say it's an inability or resistance to being alone with God, right? To being alone with God. And a lot of times with religious people, they'll like go to church and they believe that they encounter our Lord in church, or they believe that they encounter our Lord in their Bible study, or they believe that our Lord is present when they read scripture. But when they go back to their room at night and they shut the door, they just forget that God is with them there too. Right? And so from a spiritual point of view, when people have a religious background, it's teaching them to be constantly conscious of God's presence in their life every single day. Patrick Carnes talks about having like 10 criteria for addiction. And so if we want to know if any behavior is addictive, or we're trying to make an argument about why this behavior is bad for you, these are basically 10 criteria, right? There's loss of control. I do more of this behavior than I intend to do or I want to do. And we could look at any of our behaviors. Like sometimes I say, I'm going to watch one episode of this show on Netflix. And then the episode ends and it's like, the next episode starts in 20 seconds. And I think, I'm just going to watch the beginning of that next episode. Right? And then I might like sticker. And then the next thing I know, the next episode is going to begin in 20 seconds. And I end up watching more than I intended to or wanted to do. It's a compulsive behavior, which means there's a pattern of out of control behavior over time. And so somebody might be falling into this behavior like every week, every other week, every 6 weeks. Sometimes it might only be every 90 days, but it's a compulsive behavior that happens every 90 days. And so that still meets the criteria. There's repeated efforts to stop that fail. Like, I know this is bad for me, and so I'm trying to stop, and I've done lots of different things to try to stop, but I just can't seem to stop. Loss of time. So people spend a significant amount of time on that behavior, right? So if you're talking to somebody and you're trying to make an argument, sometimes when parents talk to their teenager says, well, I'm not hurting anybody. Okay, so I want you to write down how much time that is taken from your life in your lifetime, right? So calculate how many minutes over like how many days, over how many weeks, and they might figure out, wait, this is actually like robbing a lot of my time. Preoccupation, I have these invasive thoughts all the time. Inability to fulfill obligations, it interferes with work, family, school, or friends. Continuing despite consequences, like sometimes somebody gets caught and they get punished, but then they go out and do it again. Like the person who gets a drunk driving ticket and then they continue to drive after they've had something to drink. That's continuing despite consequences. Escalation, people are looking at something that's more intense or something that's more risky than they used to look at, or they might be watching pornography now that they once found to be repulsive. Losses, that comes in a lot, like when people lose their marriages, or they lose their families, or they lose their job. And having withdrawal, like it's normal when people have had this behavior and they try to stop, that they have trouble sleeping, they might have mood swings, they might be really irritable. Like that's all normal withdrawal symptoms. And so with those 10 criteria, somebody only needs to meet 3 of them in order to be considered an addict. And so if somebody meets 3 criteria, they typically should go see an addictions professional and check on that. So when we talk about addiction and we talk about these behaviors, it's important to distinguish the cause from the effects, because that's going to influence how we respond in the moment. Okay, so when we talk about the effects from a spiritual point of view, we can talk about the effects of sexual sin. It prevents us from the vision of God. Jesus says, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. And so the impure of heart can't see God. And that's my main motivation as a priest for addressing pornography broadly. The effects of that, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, are things like blindness of mind, thoughtlessness, inconstancy, right? Being unreliable, rashness, self-love, hatred of God, love of this world, abhorrence or despair of the future world, right? Other effects are sort of objectifying people. Sometimes the effect like leads into violence towards people, just general laziness, lack of empathy. Your emotional range might go from numb to frustrated all of the time. Having so much shame that you don't want to be around others, or you don't want to be around your family. A lot of times, especially with adolescents, once they discover pornography and they might have developed a bad habit, they just don't want to engage with their parents anymore. They don't want to engage with their family anymore. There's a lot of fear of being discovered. I often ask like high school students, if I'm hearing their confessions, I'll ask them, do your parents know about this? And they'll say, no, Father. Do you feel like you could ask them to help you? Do you feel like you could ask them for help? No way, Father. And so there's this fear that if they bring it up, they're not going to get help, that they're going to get punished. And so it just becomes a secret, and that secret leads to more isolation and more frustration. The causes what gets somebody into an addiction, they can be really complicated. Generally, there's 3 different kinds of addiction. The first kind is a bad habit. Typically, that's somebody who they grew up in a really connected family. They don't really have a lot of trauma, but they discovered pornography and masturbation at a young age. They kind of went back to it over and over and over again, and they have a bad habit. That person, you can basically change their behaviors or change their habit, and that can take care of the addiction. Affect regulation disorder is that person who maybe grew up in some emotional distress, maybe like mom and dad are fighting a lot, maybe there was the loss of a parent, and they're using pornography in order to regulate their mood. So every time they feel sadness or grief or anger, they just escape from their emotions by looking at pornography. The treatment for that person is going to be a little bit different, and we really have to work on developing attachment bonds, and that person probably needs some psychotherapy. And the third is trauma. And so when somebody has sexual abuse in their history, even when it's that kind of peer-to-peer sexual abuse that can oftentimes happen with a cousin or with another family member, their behaviors are oftentimes going back and repeating what had happened to them. And so when there's trauma, that really is going to take a lot more treatment. And it's going to take addressing the trauma and really naming that, right? And helping somebody process that. And so I say this because sometimes people will say something like, well, why can't you just stop? And the reason they can't just stop is they don't really understand why they do it in the first place. Patrick Carnes, when he talks about the making of a sexual addict, he has this model that he uses, and I just want to talk through the first part of it, where he says, like, addiction starts in the family. And so this was with 1,500 sex addicts that he interviewed, and 87% of them came from families where there were other addicts in the family, and that might even be like an alcoholic grandfather or a drug addict uncle, but there's other addicts in the family. 77% come from rigid family systems where there's rigid rules and everybody kind of plays their part. 87% from disengaged family systems, and that's where there's not a lot of close relationships. And then 68 come from both rigid and disengaged family systems where there's sort of rigid rules, but there's not close relationships. Like, people don't feel known or heard or understood or safe or secure within their family system. And so one of the questions that I'll oftentimes ask someone when I'm working with an adult is, like, when you were growing up, did you feel secure with your parents? Like, could you go and talk to them about anything? Did you share your life with them? And they'll say, oh yeah, my parents were amazing, and they were. And then I'll say, well, could you talk to them about the fact that you had discovered pornography when you were 12? Oh no, I couldn't talk to them about that. And so there can be a circumstance where there's kind of healthy attachment about everything except for things that have to do with sexuality. And when that's the case, that they really have that same effect of having a disengaged family system where this part of my life, I can't really share that with anyone. And again, there's those statistics on abuse or early trauma where 97% of emotional abuse, 81% sexual abuse, 72% physical abuse, which leads to trauma factors. And then, like, some catalytic environment brings out the addiction. Sometimes when I'm working with adults, they might have had a little bit of a problem in junior high or high school. They got over it. They went to college, then a parent dies, or there's a car accident or something happens, and then their addiction starts. And because the soil was there for the addiction to grow out of. And really what we want to do within family life is to till that soil and make sure that the soil of our hearts is as healthy as possible. So sometimes, like, pornography addiction is called like a love disorder, right? Or an intimacy disorder, or it can be this kind of privation of love, or like, I don't have enough love in my heart, or it's the absence of being loved. And I really do find with most of the adults I work with that when they're going to pornography because they're trying to find some kind of affirmation, or they're trying to find an experience of being loved by another. And so again, coming from a rigid, disengaged family system, that kind of abuse, or there's neglect, or there's the absence of education and affective maturity, or the absence of any kind of sex education, along with early exposure to pornography, those are those primary factors. And so what do we do about that? Like, how do we live differently? Because really we do live in a world that is different. In the past, you know, as the Catholic Church, we always said that parents are the primary educators of your children, and you have to give this information at an appropriate time and in an age appropriate way. But the question is, what's age appropriate if the average age of exposure is between 8 and 11 years old? Because again, a lot of the experience of students I work with in our Catholic schools is that they might have discovered pornography and masturbation when they were in 5th grade, and they didn't even learn that it was a sin until they were a junior in high school, right? They never learned it was wrong until later, like after they had already discovered it and formed this habit that might have even become a compulsion by then. It's interesting, again, as in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis writes on sex education, and he includes this idea that we have to educate about pornography as well. So he says, sex education should provide information while keeping in mind that children and young people have not yet attained full maturity. The information has to come at a proper time and in a way suited to their age. It's not helpful to overwhelm them with data without also helping them to develop a critical sense in dealing with the onslaught of new ideas and suggestions, the flood of pornography, and the overload of stimuli that can deform sexuality. And so that means we have to educate them about what is good, true, and beautiful, and also educate them about those things that cripple our capacity for love. And so in doing that and addressing that, like, there's some really practical tools that I want to sort of give you to get started. And the first one is closing the doors. You know, when I was growing up, we could go to the video store, and when you went to the video store, you could rent movies, but there was also this room back there that said you must be 18 to enter. And so there was no way for me to go back there and see what was back there. I was always curious about it, but I could never go through that door. Today, there's no doors in our stores. And so a kid with an iPhone, a child with an iPhone, right, they can be on Disney Plus, watching anything on Disney Plus, and then like a few clicks later, they can be on Pornhub. And there's no doors in our stores. And so filtering is a way of putting doors in our stores. It's a way of saying, like, no, we're not going to allow access to that kind of material. And so there's two places for filtering. One is at the router level. And so there's things like OpenDNS is a filter at the router level. So if you have Wi-Fi in your home, you want to make sure that your Wi-Fi is secure and that it's filtered in some way. So OpenDNS will help you to filter whatever is on your local Wi-Fi. And you also want to check your Wi-Fi connections to make sure none of your neighbors have an open Wi-Fi connection, because your children can also get on Wi-Fi there. Filtering at the device level is, there's different filters that will go on the device itself. And so like Covenant Eyes is a program that has a filter and it goes on the device itself. Another one is MobiSip. Another one is Custodio. Kaspersky Parental Controls. A lot of people like that one. And so whatever you decide to use, it's also good to filter the device itself, because when they're on their like wireless over-the-air wireless 3G, 4G, 5G connection, or they're getting on Wi-Fi somewhere else that's not protected, you want to make sure that the device is protected itself. Accountability software will send reports to you that tell you what your children are looking at when they're online, and it'll flag adult content. So Ever Accountable is one accountability software. Covenant Eyes is another accountability software, and they also have lots of good blogs and information for parents. And that just helps you have visibility over what goes on their phone. Another program a lot of parents like is Bark. Bark will monitor texts and it'll monitor social media, and it'll look for lots of different things. So Bark also looks for things like suicidal conversations or suicidal ideation or depression, or any kind of cyberbullying that's going on, and alert you to that. Bark also has a deal for school systems where they provide it for free on all the one-to-one classroom devices. Allowing apps is always a question, right? And every time you have an app on your child has an app on their phone, there's the ability for that app to access online content. And so a lot of people get in trouble with pornography on social media, like Instagram or Pinterest or Facebook and Twitter, and they find pornography in those ways. And so there's a question of what apps do I want my child to have? Snapchat is an app that sends a picture message that disappears in 10 seconds, which I usually advise parents just never let their child have Snapchat, because it's the primary way that children text each other, and they send naked pictures to each other using Snapchat. And so just getting rid of the app, it takes away the opportunity, right? It takes away the opportunity. And it's not even to be worried about your child, but to be worried about somebody that's going to ask your child for naked pictures. And so this question of privacy comes up, right? Like a lot of times, especially teenagers will say, like, I have a right to privacy. But we all also have a responsibility to transparency, especially when you own the phone that your child is on. Right. And so transparency just means like somebody has access to what's on my phone. And there's no such thing as private communication in our household. And I think that's really reasonable. Like, as privacy has increased, more and more problems have happened. So prevention through education. So what is age appropriate in the world today? These are some things that families are doing, right? Filtering conversations. I'm going to give you some tools for those. But I really want you to think about it being a race between parents, peers, and the internet. And whoever talks first is trustworthy, right? So when it comes to conversations about sexuality, your children are going to be educated by you, they're going to be educated by the internet, or they're going to be educated by their peers. And whoever talks first is trustworthy. So if the first person that talks to them or explains something to them is the kid down the street, they're always going to go to the kid down the street. And so you want to be the first one to initiate that conversation. Okay, these are some tools for talking about pornography. So, and developing what Kristen Jensen calls an internal filter, right? And so she has this book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, which is a read to your child book about what to do if you see pornography. So pornography is pictures of people with little or no clothes on. If you see it, close your eyes. Alert an adult, name it when you see it, distract your thoughts with other things in order your thinking brain to be in charge. So she has this can-do plan. And parents who read this book to their children, they typically report that it opens up a lot of safety and a lot of conversation, and their kids start naming it when they see it. And so they might be in the grocery store and their child's like, Mom, is that pornography? And the mom's like, yep, and takes the Cosmo and goes complains to the manager. The manager then might start covering up the Cosmos. But the idea is you want them to report to you if they have an exposure, so it doesn't become a secret and it doesn't become something that they're ashamed of. She also has this book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior, which is really aged about 3 to 5 years old. And it just talks about like picture poison and like how sometimes there are pictures that make us uncomfortable. And when we see those, we should like turn it off, turn away, and tell your mom or tell your dad. And so those are 2 tools, and I really recommend by 2nd grade, parents start reading that Good Pictures, Bad Pictures book to their child. In our school system, in our Catholic school system here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we started teaching the Good Pictures, Bad Pictures book in the 4th grade curriculum. And that sounds really early, but the reality is that we've had cases of kids who reported to their teacher that they've been exposed by their stepbrother or something like that. And the school is actually able to intervene and stop some peer-to-peer abuse before it had started. And so we live in a world where it's necessary to do this education at that age now. What if exposure has already happened? So there's this book by Gail Pointer who co-authored Good Pictures, Bad Pictures called Closing Pandora's Box and Empowering Parents to Help Their Children Reject Pornography. And so it's another book that will help you to walk through with a young person if they've been exposed, like what to do now, where do you go going forward? There's another website called Fortify. It's fortifyprogram.org. And Fortify is a great resource, especially for adolescents who have developed a pornography problem and they're looking for help, and they can just go there, and there's different video content that they look at in terms of explaining brain science and how habits develop and how to develop new habits or new virtues. They kind of get badges and tabs and level up, and they can invite you to be their fighter partner. What I really like about Fortify is that if a teenager is doing it, there's a certain point where there's a video where it encourages them to talk to their mom and dad and ask them for help. Father-Son Accountability is another book by John and Lucas Fort, and it provides a script for a dad to talk to his son about purity on a regular basis. Right? So if there's been a pornography exposure, it's really important to develop an ongoing conversation just about how are things going. You know, how's it going staying away from that? What can I do to help you? Like, what's going on in your emotional life? And teaching them to sort of check in regularly, right? So that shame doesn't set in, so that secrets don't set in, so they don't keep going back. No, what about like starting a conversation with somebody that's past the age of exposure? That question happens a lot. And this is just a script that I've recommended to several parents, and it seems to have worked pretty well. And so we started off like, what would Jesus do? So Jesus would have this mercy that calls to conversion, right? Mercy that calls to conversion. And in a discipline that leads to reconciliation. And so we're balancing mercy with justice, or mercy with moral consequences. And so the first thing we might do is have an amnesty day. And amnesty day is taken from my experience as a West Point cadet, when we would have dignitaries come and they would have an amnesty day where anybody who had area tour punishments where you had to walk back and forth for like 5 hours to waste your time to get punished, their hours would be canceled, right? Like no punishment. So amnesty day means in this conversation we're going to have, you can tell me anything and you're not going to get in trouble. I just want to know what's going on in your life. Right? I just want to know what's going on in your life. And so for the next hour or the next 2 hours, like anything you tell me, you're not going to get in trouble. And then we might ask them some questions like, have you ever been exposed to pornography? You know, you could open that up. Like we heard this talk by this Fr Sean guy, and he said the average age of exposure is between like 8 and 11 years old. And so like, have you ever been exposed? Like what's your experience been? And they might say like, no, I've never been exposed. And maybe you're not sure that's true. So a good follow-up question is, okay, so if you haven't been exposed, how did you avoid it? Because it seems like it's everywhere. Maybe I was exposed, right? Like one dad said, like, how did you avoid it? And he said, well, actually, like, yeah, I've seen it. And then he found out that he was exposed when he was quite young, like 3 or 4 years ago. So asking when is a really important question. You know, if you have a teenager and you find out that they have pornography on their phone, a really important question is, when was the first time you ever saw pornography? Because the first time was probably when they were much younger. And the first time they saw it, somebody probably showed it to them. And it was something that shouldn't have happened to them. And it would be appropriate to say, like, how did that make you feel at the time? You know, it kind of like made me agitated, and I didn't really I felt excited, but I kind of felt gross at the same time. And I wanted to stop looking, but I couldn't stop looking. That's all totally normal. It's a normal response. It's a totally normal response. And I'm sorry that happened to you. Right? I'm sorry that happened to you. It might be the fact that, like, I'm sorry that we didn't protect you from pornography at home. I'm sorry that we didn't put filters on the internet. You know, I didn't realize how easy it was to access all of that. You know, I didn't realize that when you went over to the neighbor's house that they didn't have a protected Wi-Fi router. And to just like speak into that, right? And it's appropriate to say, I'm sorry that happened to you, right? It can disarm, but it's also like speaking mercy into the wound, because there's always an initial wound. And we're going to do better from now on, right? We're going to do better from now on. And so I'm going to check back in with you from time to time, right? We're going to have some follow-up conversations around this. I'm going to take your phone because I want to put some software on it to make sure that you don't have access anymore. And you're going to get it back. I just need some time to make sure that we can lock that down in order to help you, right, to live the life that you want to live, or to to be the best version of yourself. In terms of like education about the good, because we do, with all of the junk that people get exposed to, especially when kids get exposed to pornography, they need to have a right vision of like what sex is really about, right? What is sex really for? And so there's several resources that can help us to do that. The first one on this slide is Catholic. It's called Wonderfully Made Babies. And I really like it because it's really correct, and they'll know exactly how a baby's made after reading this book. And it's also written within the context of the scriptural biblical narrative, in the context of like Catholic morality. After a child's read this book, they'll know exactly how a baby's made. And it's age 9 and up, and 9 and up I think is really right. The experience of my friends is that when they read that book to their child at the age of 9, the most common question afterwards is, can I go play with my cars now? It's the most common question. And it's never as awkward as the parent fears it might be. One of my friend's daughters, like after being read the book, and she just learned, like, you know, Adam has like genitals on the outside of his body, Eve has like sexual organs on the inside of her body, and when a baby's made, there's a sperm from Adam and an egg from Eve and a soul from God. She learned all of that kind of stuff. But the thing she always like was most fascinated with was that she has millions of eggs. And she's like, Dad, do you know I have millions of eggs inside of me? I have millions of eggs. And she was just like fascinated by this. And she was fascinated by the fact that she was a product of the love between her mother and her father. And when kids ask questions, it's important that you never lie to them, and you just give them enough information to satisfy the question. And so his daughter asked at one point, like, how does the sperm get to the egg? And the mom said, you know, there's a special embrace, and we'll tell you more about it when you get older. Okay. That's it. Like, okay. And then when Dad in earshot, she was like, how long does the special embrace take? Mom says, just like a minute, right? And Dad was kind of like, right? So it becomes kind of a joke, like between, or kind of a playful thing between parents. But it's important to open the conversation, because then the kid's going to come back over and over and over again. Whenever they have questions, they know that they can come to Mom and Dad. Another resource is 30 Days of Sex Talks, and that's put out by Educate Empower Kids. And so those are written for different age groups, like 3 to 5, 5 to 8, 8 to 12, etc. And those are non-religious, they're secular, and really it leaves the parent to supply the morality. God's Design for Sex series is another Christian that's written in the same way. Love Ed is another curriculum for really puberty education, which is also really important. A lot of times kids get stuck in their shame, and they have shame over like normal bodily developments that happen during puberty, right? But another kind of consequence of the hypersexualized culture is that when kids see pornography before puberty, it makes puberty harder to navigate, because just normal biological functions become occasions of reminding them of their pornography, right? Like spontaneous erections for boys become an occasion of like remembering pornography. And so again, it's important to like do that education ahead of time, but also educate them about their biology and like the biological developments that happen in normal psychosexual development. A couple other websites that I just point you to are protectyoungminds.com is Kristen Jensen's website. That's the website of the lady who wrote Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. She also has a lot of really good blogs for parents. Protectyoungeyes.com is a website that does reviews of apps. And so they'll review, like, if you have a question about what does this app do or what are the dangers, you can go to Protect Young Minds, and there's a review there. And it'll just tell you what to look out for and how to lock it down. Infoforfamilies.com, it's another website, and they also have like sample conversations to have with kids at every age range in talking about like psychosexual development. And culturereframed.org is a secular website put together by Dr. Gail Dines and a lot of really smart people. And so they have curriculum for like raising teens and raising tweens and talking to them about the dangers of pornography and the hypersexualized culture. And there's just a lot of really good information there that's backed up by a lot of really solid research and really solid science. And I am at the 46-minute mark, which is when I'm supposed to break for questions. And so I'm gonna stop my slideshow and check the question box to see what we have. If you have a router and a filter, the apps like Pinterest, or should you not have the app? So again, when we're talking about apps and filtering apps, I would really recommend going to Protect Young Eyes and checking it and seeing like how can I filter this. Typically, router filters filter based on a list, and so there's keywords that they look for. If those keywords aren't included in the content, then it's not going to get filtered out. One of the new features of Covenant Eyes is it doesn't filter based on it, but it does report based on screenshots. And there's like AI software that basically looks at screenshots, and if there's questionable screenshots, it sends it to you. So that's also going to pick up if kids are sexting, or if they're like watching something with nudity, but there's no keywords that would get filtered by filter. Can you share the slide again that outlines the dialogue to see if your child has been exposed to pornography? Yes, I can do that. And that's all the questions in the chats. Okay, here's the Q&A. Wendy says, how do we help young people, teenagers, particularly boys, to live holy purity well and to face normal temptations when they see beautiful women or young girl, perhaps dressed a bit provocatively, but short of pornography, right? And again, I think like just talking to them about like maintaining custody of the eyes is really important. You know, another way of doing that is to just like teach them to say like simple prayers, like thank Jesus, I ask your blessing on this person. Jesus, help me to look at you, right, and to see you, and not to lust after this person. And so I really think that there's that, and also just to talk to them about like seeing the beauty of that person and recognizing the beauty of that person, not to demonize attraction either. So if they see somebody and they're attracted to them, I think that would be a good thing to talk to them about. Why are you attracted to them? What's attractive about them? You know, like, do you want to spend more time with them, or like, what would you want to talk to them about? When dealing with children that are 3 years apart, do you include the younger one together with the older in pornography and sex talks, or do you tell the older not to tell their brother? So my friends have more experience with this, my friends that are married, and it's really, you have to discern. I think it's better if they're 3 years apart that you do it individually. But the discernment is, are they going to keep it? Are they going to be able to keep it from their younger brother? Like sometimes they just know that their one child is going to go and share this information with everybody in the neighborhood. So they might wait longer to have that conversation until they recognize that that child is not going to, is really going to respect, like, this is a private thing between us. And my dear friends, Matt and Jen Davis, they have 8 kids. And all the kids have had these talks, and it's kind of a rite of passage, and they talk about the fact that they've had the talks, but they don't share the information, and they just kind of like they kind of wait for, you know, the next one to get the talk, and then they probably talk to them about it afterwards. How do we help young people to, okay, we said that one. What's the best way to deal with adolescents who have been exposed to pornography? So again, asking them, like, when was their first exposure? And then like checking in with them regularly. And if like checking in with them regularly and putting filters in place isn't helping anything, and they really want help, there are like therapists who have developed programs for adolescents One that I really like is called Band of Brothers. It was developed by a sexual addiction therapist in Phoenix. And that's really effective. If just like adjusting things through filtering and accountability and continuing conversations isn't working. How can you tell a child to ask his friends not to send him inappropriate pictures so that he doesn't feel embarrassed to do it or doesn't think he will lose their friendship? I think that's just a peer pressure question, and peer pressure questions are kind of the same as they always have been, and that we're called to live differently. So some of my friends, like their strategy is that they just don't let their kids have smartphones. And there are different phones that might look like a smartphone, but they don't function like a smartphone. And then their kids' excuses, I don't have a smartphone. I can only text or call, and I don't have apps. And they live just fine without having apps. And so that's kind of the way that they do that to help their kid get around it. The official medical, psychological, cultural line is that masturbation is normal. How do you recommend speaking about this to kids? So I would say that, yes, like masturbation, it's normal for a child to discover that when they touch their genitals, it feels good. And it's normal for them to kind of explore that. And that's fine. It's not like, as a Catholic priest, we would say like it's not fine to do that compulsively and willfully, but it's a normal experience that people have. And so there's a difference between what's normal and what's healthy, right? And what's normal and what's healthy. And so it's normal for people to discover that, but it's not healthy to develop a constant habit of it. It's definitely not healthy to pair it with pornography, right? Because then it ends up being compulsive. So there's a sex addiction therapist I know, and his line is this: like, if you can masturbate only when you plan to and only when you want to, then you're not addicted, right? So if you only do it when you want to and when you plan to, so you never like do it when you don't want to do it, right? And so then a lot of people who I know in treatment, they'll just say like, yeah, that's not really possible. And so I think you just have to like kind of find your way in that. Like if your own value system is that masturbation is okay, then you really need to look at like making sure it doesn't become compulsive, and then your conversation becomes about whether or not it's compulsive. If your value system is that masturbation is not okay, then we can talk about other ways of self-soothing besides masturbation. And there are lots of other ways of self-soothing besides masturbation. Best way to deal with adolescents who have been exposed. We did not. We took away the phone from our 15-year-old. We gave him a flip phone and we left it at that. He hasn't asked again for it. We just told him he needs to show maturity and that he's not ready for it, period. We just want to give him more time to realize that he is the one hurting himself. And so again, if that 15-year-old has had a pornography problem, I would want to know, like, how old was he when he first saw it? What did he see? Like, what questions does he have about sexuality? Like, how can you backfill that, right? How can you backfill that and correct like the things that he's seen? And yeah, like we don't all need a smartphone. Okay, but I'd also be interested in like how old was he when he was exposed, and trying to repair any damage that's been done there, and also to look at his relationship with you and like how open and trusting is that. Room sharing, is it better to separate girls and boys? This isn't my area of expertise. But I do think like at a certain age, like you have to establish boundaries, and you do need to separate girls and boys, like especially like as they're approaching adolescence, as they're approaching puberty, and talk to them about privacy and boundaries and being respectful. And you're asking somebody who's dealt with a lot of people, who've had a lot of trauma, and they've had trauma with exploration that happens between like brothers and sisters if there's other sexualization that's been introduced. Do you have a point of view on best age to give a child a phone with a browser? Again, like I would give them a phone with a filtered browser, maybe, but they don't. I'm probably more leaning on the side of, I don't think kids need a phone with a browser. And a lot of times it just becomes a headache. And if you give it to them, you're responsible for monitoring and talking to them about all of these things and all these dangers and the places that they could go. And you know, the trouble that's kind of lurking for them there. I'm pulling up this slide with my conversation that I had up here. So these were those 4 questions, right? Just, have you been exposed? When were you exposed? How did that make you feel? I'm sorry that happened to you. And we're going to try to do better from now on. And again, you want to get their whole story, because you don't want to miss anything in their story. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Q&A. I think that I've covered everything in the Q&A, so thank you for that. And I've got 2 minutes. If anybody else has anything. Pilar's talking, but you're muted.
All right, I'm sorry. I wanted to thank you for sharing this valuable information with us. I think it's very eye-opening for many, and the resources that you provide are very helpful. So thank you again. I think we're all in this together, and we need as much help as we can from you and from each other. And the resources that you gave us are really useful. This is a great battle that we are all facing. So I think this has been wonderful. Thank you so much again. And for all of you that are listening, this has been recorded. If you want to watch it or share it with friends, it will be on our website later today or tomorrow. So I thank you for listening, and thank you so much, Father Sean, for your time. I know you're a very busy person, so thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a joy to be with you all.
Okay, take care. Bye.